Welcome back, everyone, to the deep dive. This time we're diving into this press release, Mountain Air in a Pill. Did you come up with this title?
I wish I could take credit for that one. But yeah, the Gladstone Institutes, folks, they always seem to have a knack for the catchy headlines.
Scientists develop drug that extends life and reverses brain damage. So what are we looking at here?
Well, it's all about this new drug, HypoxyStat. It's designed to mimic the effects of living at high altitude.
Oh, wow. Like, you mean instead of actually having to train on a mountaintop, you can just pop a pill and get the same benefits?
Exactly. Pretty amazing stuff, right?
So what kind of benefits are we talking about here?
The study focused on mice with Leigh Syndrome, a rare genetic disease that affects the mitochondria, those little powerhouses in our cells that produce energy.
Right, the mitochondria. I vaguely remember those from biology class. So what's going on with them in Leigh syndrome?
Basically, they're not working properly. They can't produce energy efficiently, which leads to all sorts of problems, especially in the brain.
And the article mentioned this is often fatal in childhood.
Unfortunately, yes. The lack of energy and the buildup of toxic byproducts from those malfunctioning mitochondria, it can cause severe damage.
So where does high altitude come into play here? How does that connect to Leigh syndrome?
Well, that's where things get really interesting. There's been this growing body of research looking at the health benefits of living at high altitudes.
Yeah, like how athletes train at altitude to boost their performance.
Exactly. But it goes beyond just athletic performance. Studies have shown that chronic exposure to low oxygen can trigger some interesting adaptations in the body. It might even reduce the risk of heart disease or even increase lifespan.
Wait a minute, hold on. Are you saying that less oxygen can sometimes be a good thing? That's kind of counterintuitive, isn't it?
It is, and it really highlights how adaptable the human body can be. But what's especially fascinating is the link between low oxygen and mitochondrial diseases like Leigh syndrome.
Oh, okay, so you're saying that deliberately reducing oxygen intake could actually be beneficial for those with this disease. Now I'm really curious.
Researchers have been studying this for a while. Back in 2016, a study showed that mice with Leigh syndrome who were kept in a low-oxygen environment, essentially mimicking a high-altitude setting, actually lived longer and had less severe symptoms.
So the idea is that by limiting oxygen, you're giving those struggling mitochondria a break, right? Preventing them from getting overloaded and producing those harmful byproducts.
You got it.
That's incredible. So is that where HypoxyStat comes in? It's like a way to simulate that high-altitude environment without actually having to live on the mountaintop?
Exactly. You could say that HypoxyStat is like bottled mountain air. It tricks the body into thinking it's at high altitude by reducing the amount of oxygen delivered to the tissue.
Okay, now I gotta know, how do they even do that? How do you bottle the effects of altitude into a pill? It sounds like science fiction.
It does, doesn't it? But the science behind it is actually pretty elegant. It all comes down to hemoglobin.
Hemoglobin, right? The molecule in our red blood cells that carries oxygen around the body.
You got it. Now, what's really interesting is that HypoxyStat actually makes hemoglobin bind oxygen more tightly.
So wouldn't that mean more oxygen is delivered to the tissues?
You'd think so, right? But here's the twist. Because hemoglobin is holding onto oxygen so tightly, it actually releases less of it to the tissues. It's like a delivery truck that's hoarding its cargo instead of making its deliveries.
Oh, I see. So by making hemoglobin cling to the oxygen, less of it actually reaches the cells. Clever.
And that, in turn, creates that low oxygen environment that seems to be beneficial in cases like Leigh syndrome.
Wow, that is seriously clever science. But how did they even stumble upon this compound in the first place?
It's a great example of serendipity in science, really. They were actually working with a company called Maze Therapeutics, who had been developing this compound for a completely different purpose, treating sickle cell anemia.
Wow, so they were originally working on something totally unrelated and then realized, hey, this could actually be a game changer for mitochondrial diseases.
Precisely. And the results they've seen in mice, they're really promising. They found that HypoxyStat not only extended their lifespan significantly.
Like, how much longer are we talking?
We're talking 3 times longer. But it also reversed some of the brain damage and muscle weakness associated with the disease.
Hold on, it actually reversed the damage. I thought we were just talking about slowing down the progression. That's incredible.
It is exciting, but it's important to remember that this is still early-stage research. What works in mice doesn't always translate perfectly to humans.
Right, of course. But the potential is definitely there.
Absolutely.
Okay, so let's talk about that potential. This study focused on Leigh syndrome, which, as you mentioned, is very rare. What about other mitochondrial diseases? Could this drug be helpful for those too?
That's a great question. Researchers are definitely exploring that. There are actually hundreds of different mitochondrial diseases out there.
So is HypoxyStat like a potential one-size-fits-all solution, or would they need to tweak it for each specific disease?
It's probably too early to say for sure, but my guess is that it would likely need to be tailored to the specific needs of each patient and their particular condition.
Right, treating each person as an individual rather than just a blanket approach. Makes sense. This is all so fascinating, but I want to get back to this idea of bottling the effects of altitude for a second. What other conditions besides mitochondrial diseases might benefit from this kind of approach? It's like we're opening up this whole new toolbox for medicine, right? Instead of just focusing on drugs that target specific molecules or pathways, we're thinking about like how to actually harness the power of our environment
Yeah, it's really a paradigm shift.
to influence our health.
Exactly. And it's not just about altitude either. Think about all the other environmental factors that play a role in our well-being. Sunlight, temperature,
Yeah, like getting your vitamin D.
even the types of bacteria we're exposed to.
So are you saying that we might one day have pills that mimic the benefits of, like, say, a walk in the forest or a dip in the ocean? That sounds crazy.
Maybe not so crazy. We're already seeing this concept applied in other areas of research. For example, there are scientists studying the effects of specific gut bacteria on mental health.
Oh, wow. So instead of traditional antidepressants, you might one day just pop a probiotic pill that's full of mood-boosting microbes.
It's a possibility. And think about the potential applications for conditions like cardiovascular disease or even cancer. What if we could manipulate the body's internal environment to make it less hospitable to tumor growth or improve blood flow?
This is blowing my mind. It's like science fiction becoming reality. But okay, let's come back down to earth for a minute and talk about HypoxyStat specifically. You mentioned earlier that what works in mice doesn't always translate to humans. What are some of the challenges they might face in bringing this drug to human trials?
Well, safety is always the top priority, right? We need to make sure that long-term use of HypoxyStat doesn't have any unintended consequences. Remember, we're talking about manipulating oxygen delivery here, which is pretty fundamental to our survival.
Right, you don't want to mess with that too much. So how do they even test that?
It starts with rigorous preclinical studies, testing different doses and durations of treatment in animals to look for any potential side effects. And then, if those studies look promising, they would move on to human clinical trials.
And those trials would involve people with Leigh syndrome?
Yes, initially the focus would be on patients with Leigh syndrome, since that's the condition that they've studied most extensively so far. They would start with small groups of patients, carefully monitoring their response to the drug and looking for any adverse effects.
It's amazing to think that something that started out as a study in mice could actually end up helping real people.
Yeah, it really is.
But let's say everything goes smoothly and HypoxyStat proves to be both safe and effective in humans. Then what?
Well, the next step would be to seek approval from regulatory agencies, like the FDA here in the United States, to make the drug commercially available.
And that process can take a while, right?
It can, yes. There's a lot of paperwork and additional testing involved to make sure the drug meets all the necessary safety and efficacy standards.
Okay, so let's fast forward a bit. Imagine that HypoxyStat is approved and it's on the market. Do you think it would be accessible to everyone who needs it?
That's a really important question, and unfortunately, there's no easy answer. One of the biggest challenges with rare diseases, like Leigh syndrome, is that the patient population is relatively small.
And that means there's less financial incentive for pharmaceutical companies to invest in developing treatments, right?
Exactly. So even if a drug like HypoxyStat is successful, it might still be very expensive, making it out of reach for many patients.
That's really disheartening. It feels like there's this constant tension between scientific progress and the realities of our healthcare system.
Absolutely. It's a complex issue, and there are no easy solutions. But I do think that raising awareness about these challenges is an important first step.
Okay, so let's shift gears a bit and talk about the bigger picture. We've been focusing on HypoxyStat and its potential applications, but what about the implications for the future of medicine as a whole? What does this research tell us about the direction we're heading in?
Well, I think this research represents a paradigm shift in how we think about treating disease. It's moving away from the traditional model of just targeting specific molecules and pathways, and instead looking at how we can actually manipulate the body's internal environment to promote healing.
It's like instead of fighting the disease head on, we're sort of creating conditions where the body can heal itself, right?
Exactly. It's a more holistic approach. It recognizes that our health is influenced by a complex interplay of factors, not just our genes or the presence of a particular pathogen.
And this idea of mimicking environmental factors with medication, could that potentially go beyond just drugs? I mean, are there other ways we could harness those benefits?
Absolutely. Think about things like virtual reality, for example. What if you could immerse yourself in a simulated high-altitude environment without actually having to climb a mountain?
You mean like a virtual Everest base camp?
Exactly. Or imagine a virtual rainforest, where you could experience the sights, sounds, even the air quality of that environment. We're just beginning to scratch the surface of what's possible here.
It's almost like we're merging the boundaries between the physical and digital worlds to create these like hybrid therapeutic experiences.
Precisely. And who knows what other exciting possibilities might emerge as we continue to explore this frontier.
This is all so fascinating. I'm sure our listeners are just as captivated by these ideas as we are. But I do want to make sure we address one more important aspect of this research, the potential ethical considerations. As with any groundbreaking scientific advancement, there are always questions about how it might be used or misused. So let's take a moment to discuss those. It feels like we're on the verge of this whole new world of medicine, almost like science fiction. But like with any powerful tool, there's always the question of, responsible use. What are some of the ethical concerns around this bottled air concept?
Well, one immediate concern is the potential for misuse. Like if HypoxyStat proves to be safe and effective for people with Leigh syndrome, what's to stop healthy individuals from seeking it out, right? Hoping to, I don't know, enhance their performance or maybe even slow down aging.
So it's like taking this whole altitude training thing to an extreme, but instead of athletes pushing their limits, it's people wanting to like biohack their way to a longer life.
Exactly. And that raises questions about fairness and accessibility. Would this create a scenario where only the wealthy can afford these kind of enhancement, potentially widening the gap between, the haves and have-nots?
That's a really important point. And even beyond just access, there's the whole question of unintended consequences. I mean, we're talking about manipulating a fundamental biological process here, oxygen delivery. Could there be unforeseen risks that we're not even aware of yet?
Absolutely. That's why rigorous testing and long-term monitoring, that's crucial. We need to be cautious, proceed with, a healthy dose of skepticism, especially when we're talking about manipulating something as essential as oxygen.
It's like a reminder that nature has its own wisdom. Sometimes, tinkering with those finely tuned systems, it can backfire.
Precisely. And even if we can, manage the scientific and ethical challenges, there's still the question of societal acceptance. How comfortable are people with the idea of, manipulating their internal environment to achieve certain goals?
Yeah, it definitely pushes the boundaries of what we consider normal or natural. It almost feels like we're entering this uncharted territory where the lines between medicine, lifestyle, and enhancement, they all start to blur.
That's a really insightful observation, I think. And it highlights the need for, open and honest conversations about these complex issues. We need to engage with the public, share the science in an accessible way, and address their concerns thoughtfully.
Right. It's not just about the scientists or the doctors making these decisions in a vacuum, right? It's about society as a whole grappling with these questions and deciding what kind of future we want to create.
Exactly. It's a collective responsibility, and it requires not just scientific expertise, but also ethical awareness and a commitment to, inclusivity.
Well said. So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the one takeaway you hope our listeners will walk away with?
If I had to choose just one, I think it would be this. Scientific progress is incredible, but it's not a magic bullet. We need to approach these advancements with both excitement and caution, recognizing that they come with, both potential benefits and potential risks.
It's like that old saying, with great power comes great responsibility, right?
Exactly. And it's up to all of us, scientists, policymakers, everyday citizens, to ensure that this power is used wisely and ethically.
Well, on that note, thanks for joining us on this deep dive. It's been a fascinating journey, exploring the potential of mountain air in a pill. For our listeners out there, here's a final thought to ponder. If scientists can manipulate oxygen delivery with such precision, what other environmental factors could we potentially mimic with drugs? The possibilities are, truly mind-boggling. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.